This is H9, you probably know about it. It's how humans and computers interact. I've always felt there's something a bit missing. I want to talk a little bit about buttons. Buttons are they fit into the actuation phase. They are amazing because when you push a button, you can feel that you're pushing a button. And this happens before you even create a signal. So you have this idea of haptic anticipation. This is different from haptic feedback, where you get a rumble or something like that, because that still happens after the fact. Haptic anticipation happens before. At the moment you create that engagement and that communication, you kind of start a race between touch and your other senses. So in terms of touch, you immediately know that you've made the signal, so it's coming straight back to your brain. And this has to race against the feedback coming from the gameplay system, so the sound and the visuals and the haptic feedback. Visuals are slower to interpret than sound. Sound is basically haptic itself. So you start this race between your finger pressing a button and the game playing through. What is life like without haptics, without haptic anticipation? Well, we know already. We've got touchscreens which react as soon as you touch them, but you cannot quite tell that you're about to touch them. And we've got Kinects where you don't really know when you're going to provide a signal. The computer just decides that you've provided a signal. This is super excellent. This deals with the touchscreen problem pretty nicely in that it just treats the entire screen as a button or splits it in half. The Steam controller is trying to do some nice stuff with haptic feedback. The rollerball really works very well. The control has this kind of very fine-tunable haptic feedback, and so you get this kind of rollerball kind of feeling to it on the right-hand side. But on the left-hand side, they're trying to split this continuous trackpad area into discrete up, down, left, right areas. And unfortunately, you cannot feel when the up, down, left, right threshold changes. So it's haptically invisible. You cannot tell what you're doing. And this is important because although we have muscle memory, our thumbs forget where they are on a certain area. So you're going to have to learn where the dead zone was on the left screen. That's kind of no good. And it's why modal versus pseudo-modal stuff is good, because with a caps lock key, you kind of have to remember that it's on. With the shift key, you hold down the key and implicitly you're pressing a button so you can tell it's on. Joysticks already have this kind of haptic feedback. Springs are in there, and they always pull your thumb back to the center, so you don't have to remember anything. And in fact, they're bilaterally arranged, so you have a kind of north, south, east, west orientation now. Your thumb can tell what is north, what is south, and what is east and west. And you don't have to see that through the screen, you see it through your thumb. There are some experiments to try and fix this. The Microsoft Surface keyboard is pressure sensitive. Unfortunately, it doesn't have that hysteresis where you get a snap. So you just go over this linear threshold and you press the button. So if you have very heavy hands, you're going to be pressing buttons when you don't mean to. You can make the touchscreens more responsive, like this was a problem before, this is a fixable thing, but it only does so much because you just don't have the touch. You can try and put these kind of buttons on, but unfortunately that kind of hysteresis still sucks because it feels like this, except you can't see what you're doing. So we'll do this instead. Just fuck off, basically. You have to design around the interface, but you don't always get to choose what interface you're using. As designers, design around it. But kind of this, I don't know, you get put into awkward positions with this. It's actually very limiting not to have touch at all. You really want the interface to communicate the player's intent with what goes in the game. That's the mark of a good interface. So if we go into the input section here, we've got noisy bodies, we've got this full range of expression. We do need to boil it down, we need to filter it out so that as designers or engineers, we can figure out what the signal is. What is the player trying to say? With the button, that's great. We just boil it down to a Boolean, and this is actually has a massive range of expression. I mean, in Super Meat Boy, the reason it feels so good is that when you let go of the button, your velocity drops out during a jump, just completely drops out. It doesn't go into a slower gravity, it just drops out. And that makes it feel like you're totally in control. Every signal is used, every part of the button. Dead zone, similarly, you kind of don't want the area around the dead zone to be picked up by joystick, because that just results in your character moving around when you're not actually actively engaging in it. You don't provide any kind of force, and no output comes out. For single axis, if you want to boil down an axis into a binary, you want to have double dead zones, so you don't kind of flip-flop. So you want a deep dead zone and then a release dead zone, which are separate from one another, so that you can prevent flip-flopping. Analog filtering is used when you do want more of the signal. But of course, we have to boil all this down into just these chunks, and they are just integers and floats on a computer. So we have a minimum amount that we can pick up, and you can see it in this little demo which I've done earlier. If I'm moving the mouse very slowly, I only pick up ones and zeros and everything in between. Even though my hand's moving steadily, it's only picking up those scant signals. So you have to do, so you'll see this happen in some FPS games. If you're zoomed in really close, you'll aim to the left and it jumps too far. You aim to the right, it jumps too little. So for one of our games, we had to rotate the shape and cut it at a very precise angle. And we couldn't get the fidelity we needed. In fact, on one Android device, it only gave us every other pixel of resolution. So we started off with a low-pass filter. This is a quick and simple, brain-dead way to do filtering. It's not great though, because it's basically one value chasing after the current value, which kind of like subdues it a bit, but it also means that you maintain a bit of momentum from the historical values you've been putting on, which means that when your finger comes to a stop, the game doesn't come to a stop. Feels wrong. Signal processing takes time. It takes a few frames. You need multiple samples over time, and of course that hurts responsiveness. So we do this thing of late-weighted averages. You sample the last 10 or so samples, and you weight the most recent, the freshest sample the most. And if you're moving the mouse very fast, you don't need to do this at all, because you're not dealing with tiny values that you need to get the in-betweens of, so you can get straight up to the responsive stuff when the mouse is moving fast. I don't recommend mouse acceleration. It creates a mental model in your mind that the mouse is not a one-to-one relationship with the cursor on the screen in this kind of complicated, dynamic way, which doesn't actually help. So we get into computation. So this is the actual what the game plays is that's happening as a result of your input and the techniques that you use. Just an example, if you're picking your animation style, you'll get these arguments with the animators because they'll want a full anticipation set of frames, and you'll want the player to be in the air as soon as they press a button so it feels responsive. So this was good enough for Mario, but not good enough for Prince of Persia, where you're waiting for about 8 frames before you actually jump. There are ways to get around this. If you do want high fidelity animation, you can still have a stylized animation style, and you can just throw people into different crazy poses and make up the difference with amazing particle effects and special effects. And this is to, no, seriously, this works. You can, if you put in enough dust kicking up, it sells the eye this illusion that a huge amount of power went behind that change in pose. You can also have a more hands-off approach, where you just use less buttons and steer people around, and let a kind of animation tree system do stuff for you, but then you're into the same problem as the Steam controller, and then you have invisible thresholds for when your character moves into different trigger zones. Or you can build the anticipation into the mechanic itself. In Skate, you have to physically crouch down, well, with your thumb anyway, and then flip up again. And that just turns it into this arcadey simulation and really puts you in the position of a hover skater, which you feel like you have to consider what they have to consider. You can treat the animation length itself as gameplay, which is what all fighting games do. There's an inherent risk-reward to the amount of time an attack takes. But if you're going to do that, You need to make sure that you're still listening to the player while those attacks are being played out. So you can do this idea of input buffering and string a move into the next move if the input was received soon enough. A good example of this is buffering specials in Street Fighter 4. If you do a full Hadouken while still doing a normal move, the normal move will cancel if it hits another player and it will go straight into that super move, which is a very useful tactic. Gesture recognition is kind of implicitly really slow because you have to wait for the gesture to be performed before you can have a feedback. So if you're doing something where you're trying to directly control somebody in the game, then that's kind of terrible. So what I would suggest is think of gestures in the most atomic form. One sample of a finger is a tap or a press. 2 samples performs a swipe, and 3 can establish a curve. Or in the case of Fruit Ninja, it's this continuously updated gesture is the way you can think about it. You can also retcon your gameplay. So what I mean by this is that you spend time trying to record that gesture and notice it. So you need to win back that time somehow to keep the responsiveness up. So what you can do is roll back your gameplay and do the event as if it was done 2 or 3 frames ago. And this actually works. It's crazy. There's a snap in animation. It looks bad on game trailers, but your players will thank you for it. All this stuff, it adds up. I'm not even going to talk about how streaming games contributes to this. It's just all bad. So we're back to the issue earlier. It's important to keep this responsiveness up for the simple reason that this is the race between the haptic anticipation and visual feedback loop, right? We receive these signals at the same time, and in our head, we can give a bit of lenience to smoosh them together and make it feel like we are physically in control of that virtual thing. We have a kind of virtual proprioception, a presence in that virtual world. We can actually do better than just reaction time, though. We can predict the future, and that's part of the your mechanic design and your AI and your behaviors. You don't just react to these little telegraphing icons and things like that in the game. You get an idea of the AI's overall state machine, and that, because that's deterministic, you can use that to your advantage. It's exploitable. And the reason we can do this is because of Bayesian probability, and look this guy up, he's cool. We get used to those systems, we learn them, we get better at them, and it's as if we're predicting the system and being faster than reaction. This is still true in multiplayer games because although human beings are not state machines, they are also not beyond predictability. They will perform the same kind of moves in sequence in a row, and you can use that to your advantage by conditioning people into thinking that you're predictable and then doing something else, and that's why I will always be. Is this kinesthetics? No, none of this is kinesthetics. This is all game feel. This is the craft. A lot goes into it, right? This is just tip of the iceberg stuff. We're just creating a bridge into an experience, and it can be a nice bridge and it can be juiced to hell, but it's still just a bridge. What are we trying to say with it? So at the time of the century, we made movies. We were really bad at it. And we got better. We decided to see it as a visual medium, and we can look to art for that, and composition. And then talkies came in, and even then it really wasn't necessarily just about narrative, it was about the overall picture. You're going to have to read that later, we don't have time. Games are in a state where, people use it as an excuse that games are a young medium, but I think we're old enough, we should know better. Oh no, we're gonna make movies, right, okay. So we throw these heavyweight writers and directors and everything like that at games, and it still doesn't quite land the punch. And we think that's because, the movie is not interactive, so we should go after full body experiences. And I don't know if I think that's totally necessary. I wonder what the end game is with that. I wonder if we really need to be fully immersed in that kind of way. let us wake up and step away. We don't need to be stuck in the machine. That shouldn't be our attitude to a game. We need to be able to unplug. When you put an Oculus Rift on, it's like putting in a blindfold to the world. You're really aware that you can hear everything around you, and you're in two places at once. And once I was showing some friends in, I put it on, and 5 minutes later they were getting off with each other behind my back. And I think with the Kinect, you can't tell when it wants to read a signal from you. It's just going to do it regardless. You can't call out to somebody without shooting a fireball off. Where is that interactive prophylactic? We need to have a separation. It's important. Because the reason we need that is because we don't need it. It's because we have suspension of disbelief. We are already immersed in games. It happens already when everything's responsive and everything works. We don't necessarily believe that we are that character. We don't necessarily believe that we are controlling every muscle in his body. But it's more like dancing in somebody else's skin, using an instrument, a strange instrument. And it's not as if we're playing along to an existing symphony where we're being creative too, we're jamming, we're putting together mechanics on our own terms and dancing with it. So I'm saying today, embrace feel. We've got so much we can do with what we already have. What am I trying to say? If this is a discipline, and this is supposed to do more than just be, good enough, great controls, like in a review, then we need to have higher goals. We need to say something with the choices we make in the design of controls. When you come home, you walk around the house, and you pick stuff up and you look at it and you form a narrative that way. In an early alpha, whenever you would pick things up and put them down again, things would fall with physics, and you know how janky game physics can be. You ended up feeling like this burglar running around your house, and you would go into your sister's room, and I don't know about you, but when I'm running around my sister's room looking at stuff, I'm really careful about putting things back. So they put in this put-back mechanic. And people played along with it, and they weren't railroaded into it. It wasn't their only option. They wanted to put things back for that very reason. Tanya, when you're teens, it captures that awkward teenage feeling of not knowing what to do with your body. It undermines muscle memory. It keeps switching around these controls as you're trying to play it, and you have to try and remember from moment to moment what you're meant to be doing. It's a comedy of errors, and it works pretty well in a kind of party situation. Quark is the opposite. Let's give you full control, absolute full control. Then you kind of start to appreciate, I don't want this. Please, just press forward and I go forward, and the legs, the motor cortex takes over. Gish is great as an example of an unconventional hero. He's a platform game character, but he doesn't really have a jump button per se. He changes states. He gets harder, softer, stickier. You do your jumps by wrapping him around a corner and then changing state, and he kind of flies off. And you can see this is like Quark, like overcomplicated, and you never get your head around it, but actually it's totally masterable. And Shadow of the Colossus, you spend the entire game learning to get to grips with the grip mechanic. And in that grip mechanic, that thing runs out and you get a feel for the mechanics. And you get to the end, I'm spoiling it, I'm sorry, but you're being pulled arse over elbow towards this white pool of light. And as you're falling, you're thinking, oh, there's a ledge there, okay, I'll grab onto that. And you grip on for a while and you start looking around, where's the exit, how do I get out? Because it's a platform game thing, right? Because I'm using the controls, right? So there must be an exit, yeah? And so you're like, maybe I can't see it from here, so you let go a little bit. You grab again, and like, no, still an exit. It's like, wait, what's going on here? Okay, like, I'm going to die here, all right? Please. No, okay, okay, all right. But the horse that died is going to come back. He's going to save me because I'm a hero, right? I'm a hero. I killed all those monsters. Come on, you're on my side, right? The wind rushes past you, and very slowly you're realizing this is it. And before your meter even runs out, you let go. We seem to not give these control schemes kind of enough effect. There's been loads of talks here about the business side of things, and do we forget that we need to make a good game? And do we forget that we need to really master these things that we already have on our plate, but we don't have to wait for new interfaces to make these things possible. They're possible now. And we can't do it without the disciplines that have come before. This stuff only exists in concert with other people. It's an ensemble discipline. But I still think it's its own thing. There's these amazing people doing amazing work. Young villain named Vladimir, I'm going to have that in there. He's done tennis, which is the best tennis game I've ever played, ever. And it's just because it understands how the controls should feel. It makes you feel more like a tennis player than any other tennis game I've played. Tommy Referency made this game with such finely tuned controls that at the time it just put people in their arse while they were chasing after new mechanics they have to slap on top of everything, achievements, or just perfunctory stuff to kind of raise the value of the game. He just showed that a well-honed mechanic can eclipse all of that. And Eskil Steamboat, you probably won't have seen much of the stuff. You'll have seen Love, which is beautiful, quite confusing, but he's going around showing people these amazing new interfaces, which are just absolutely gorgeous. So just watch out for that. I just kind of want to leave you with this. Have a look there and see if anything I'm talking about fits into any category here. I don't say this because I want a BAFTA. I don't cover it BAFTA every day. I just think that maybe we're going to have a BAFTA for family fellowship. Maybe we should have something that's the equivalent, in my mind, of cinematography for games. And I know that's about it, but I'll leave you with this. We have time for questions. Hello.
Hey Aubrey, I don't work at BAFTA anymore, but it was me who called that category game design rather than just design.
Right.
So
I feel like it didn't quite fit in there. Because my experience of game design is that game design kind of goes on at an application level, and it's like, is this a good product? And can we get all these mechanics into a design document? And I've never found that any good feeling game comes out of a design document. It comes from reading between the lines. It's like doing a guitar solo live or something. I don't know, it really is so organic that I felt like it needed something different.
Do you feel this is what other disciplines would call interaction design? Sorry, that's my serious question.
Oh, okay. Borderline. It's borderline, because this is, you can intentionally do horrible things to your player with a control scheme in order to make a point. You can subvert it, but when it's called design, I think it kind of loses some of the art side of that. It suggests that we need to make a viable product, one that won't, furrow anybody's brows while they're using it. But actually, we can subvert all these things I've been talking about. There's Proteus, for instance, has the crappy smoothing for its first-person views, and I told Ed to keep that in because it fits. It makes sense. It goes against logic, but it fits. You're in a dream world, so you might as well have a kind of slightly dreamy control scheme.
But that in itself is a kind of interaction that someone has. Anyway, sorry. We can ask.
Sure, no, it's all. Any others? Oh,
How to choose. You can
okay.
answer both and then decide
Let's go for Christoph.
What was the worst control scheme you ever came up with and what did you learn?
I worked on a game called Goo, which was either the best or the worst, and it was you controlled an entire liquid body. That was one of the first things I ever did, and it was too much for me. You're talking about controlling the springs between the blobs, hundreds of blobs at once, and so the idea was that the overall chaotic mess, you'd somehow be able to control it, and Tommy managed it, but I didn't. And so I learned to look at Tommy and see what he was doing, which was learning his graph and getting better at that stuff.
So a lot to take in that talk, so it's definitely going to be one I'm going to watch again on YouTube. There's so much great stuff in there. Where else can I go to find out more about kinesthetics and games?
Oh, I have a site, but I don't recommend it. There's a few things there, and I do want to get to the point where I'm talking about the artistic side of it, but right now I'm kind of covering all the ground, which I think you need. You can't just say, oh, I've got an idea for a mechanic and not know how it honestly works with the machine. So, that's probably the other place. But this is the thing, I'm advocating for this being a subject unto itself. And that more should be talked about it, because it tends to be done by people who are programmers, and they're kind of expected to just engineer this stuff out when it's written in a design document, and there's so much more to it than that. But they don't want to sound artsy, right? They're programmers. So
is that the answer? Not really mine.
no.
Okay. Can I ask you where your website is?
No.
I'd like to tell you this little bit of story, okay? When we do all these talks, we get all the talks submitted to us, okay? I got one about midnight last night?
Yeah.
Yeah, midnight last night, okay? And he said, I've been working on this, we refined after all the talks yesterday, and I opened it up and I saw 97 slides. I went, after that? But he did, so I think he deserves another round of applause.